I'm Alistair Hudson. This is Securities Law, Section A, the sources of securities law. The financial crisis changed everything, and yet, in terms of securities regulation, it hasn't yet changed a thing. What on earth does that mean? The financial regulatory culture has clearly changed profoundly. Securities regulation, talking in 2013 when I'm recording this, was created in the previous decade, and it hasn't yet come to the top of the EU legislative agenda to change that regulatory culture wholesale. So a large number of those regulatory principles still exist, but the way in which regulators and individual jurisdictions are seeking to implement their powers has changed radically. So the beginning of this course, which is a requirement for you to go on to the other bits, is to understand what the sources of securities law are, because that can be quite confusing in itself. The whole purpose of this course is to give you a map through the thicket. Okay? There are huge numbers of regulations. If you were to print out the regulatory rule book from the websites, hundreds and thousands of pages long. Okay? Don't be put off by that, because all you need is a good map and a guide, and it all makes sense. And that's what this course is all about, because this is a very important part of corporate and financial practice in the City of London and elsewhere across the EU and in other jurisdictions as well. So all you need is a guide, and then once you understand the lie of the land, everything else falls into place. Now this course is predicated on the securities law sections in my book, The Law of Finance, and also on the book I've written called Securities Law. Now, securities law is a combination of the securities regulations which the UK has derived from EU legislation, and also the substantive law, contract law, tort law, property law, and everything else. So it's a combination, a synthesis of those sources. So let's begin at the beginning. The way in which securities regulation is created across the European Union up to now has been via something called the Lamfalussy methodology. Now, the Baron Lamfalussy was a central banker from Belgium who was asked to look into the way in which the European Union went about creating its legislation. And the way in which it used to go about creating its legislation took years and years for it to work its way through all of that legislative architecture in the EU, which you've probably studied in a law degree somewhere at some point. But we look at those central principles again in this course, don't worry if you haven't. And what the Lamfalussy committee realised was it was just taking too long. And so things needed to be speeded up. And so what they suggested was, let's just have directives at the EU level which set out so-called high-level principles, the big picture principles, the big picture rules, and then the Commission will produce detailed technical regulations to deal with the real nitty-gritty. And that meant that in each member state, their competent authority, their principal regulator, would be charged with the job of implementing those high-level principles and those detailed regulations into their own domestic law. Why this signalled a big change was those high-level principles could therefore be flexible, they could be malleable, so that when markets changed, or when entirely new markets came into existence, those high-level principles could be adapted far more easily, instead of having old-fashioned legislation, which once the world had changed, that legislation didn't fit it anymore. And indeed, the old Investment Services Directive, which had been passed in 1993, had been passed almost in complete ignorance of derivatives. So the derivatives markets materialised, matured, particularly through the 1990s they matured, and that directive had been completely out of date from the moment it became law. So the Lamfalussy methodology created a whole new way of doing things. Among its weaknesses, however, was that it left it to member states to decide how they would implement those rules. And even just looking at two common law jurisdictions in the EU, the way in which that was done in the UK, the way in which that was done in Ireland, was really quite different. And the rules themselves could really be quite different in their detail. And London had always made it one of its big selling points that its regulations were more stringent than regulations everywhere else. So the UK's implementation of these directives had always been more stringent than the EU minimum that was required in the directives. Now, when the financial crisis hit, suddenly we have a change in approach. The French president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, said, "Le laissez-faire, c'est fini." We're not going to have this kind of laxity anymore. Instead, we want to have a single rule book. We want to have more stringency. And the Larosière report, which was produced in 2009 in the immediate wake of the financial crisis, which reached its nadir in the autumn of 2008, the Larosière report suggested we need to have much, much better global cooperation between regulators, cooperation within the EU as well. We also need to have a single rule book for the European Union, so we can't have these different implementation strategies in different member states. And we must simply have regulators on the front foot behaving much, much differently in relation to financial markets. And so the EU has really begun to prioritise derivatives markets, the regulation of hedge funds, the regulation of credit rating agencies and so on. The activities that were most closely associated by the Larosière report with that regulatory failure. So securities markets and securities regulation have yet to be subjected to that same modernisation, but it will undoubtedly come in time. And so that's a very important backdrop to all of this, that policy. We in this course will also then look at those particular securities directives and what their principal policies are in detail. And then we look also at how it's now the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK has acted as the competent authority here in implementing and overseeing the application of those regulations. And so what we look at in this course, we look at the prospectus rules, we look at the disclosure and transparency rules, we look at the listing rules, we look at all the regulations on market abuse, we look at the way in which the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive from the EU has been implemented across the full range of FCA regulation in the UK as well. So you can see this as both a study of EU securities regulation and also as a study of its implementation in the UK. Very importantly, this course enables you to take your own pathways through the material. So you're not just stuck with one particular way of looking at this course. You really can follow where your own interests lie. And you can study this in terms of, put it crudely in the assessments, writing essays about how all these big picture principles fit together. What should the regulatory future be for the EU? And also in terms of dealing practically with practical problems as well. And I'm sure you'll find this course every bit as enjoyable as I am.